From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The jockeying begins on Capitol Hill between Republicans and Democrats, but also between the House and the Senate over U.S. aid to Israel, Ukraine, and more. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell and columnist Kim Strassel. President Biden has made a request of about $106 billion, $14 billion for Israel, $62 billion roughly for Ukraine, $9 billion for humanitarian aid, including in Gaza, and $7.4 billion for the Indo-Pacific. And we are now having a debate on Capitol Hill between whether to move pieces of this as one package or items as standalone bills. And let's start with the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, on Fox News Sunday, making the argument for taking these one at a time.
We're going to move a standalone Israel funding bill this week in the House. I know our colleagues, our Republican colleagues in the Senate have a similar measure. We believe that that is a pressing and urgent need. There are lots of things going on around the world that we have to address, and we will. But right now, what's happening in Israel takes the immediate attention, and I think we've got to separate that and get it through. I believe there'll be bipartisan support for that, and I'm going to push very hard for it.
Kate, what do you make of the Speaker's strategy there? And now that we have a copy of the $14 billion bill that the House has put out for Israel alone, what is in it?
Well, I think if you step back here for a second, the fighting in Washington is completely absorbed with this question of whether aid for Israel should move with Ukraine or Ukraine and a border package should move separately from a bill from Israel and Taiwan. And I think it's important to note that the larger picture here, when you strip all that away, is whether both political parties in Washington are going to overcome their narrow parochial interests and support two U.S. friends that are fighting for their national survival and a third in Taiwan who is at risk of attack. So that's the larger picture. And then we have the House is going to vote on this Israel bill. Lots of good stuff in it for Israel, more money for Israel to procure interceptors for its air defense systems, not just Iron Dome that can shoot down Hamas rockets, but it's more sophisticated systems like David Sling and Arrow, which are becoming more relevant as the Houthis in Yemen launch longer range, more sophisticated missiles. Also some funding for, U.S. forces are going to be working overtime in the neighborhood as a result of this conflict, some money for that. So it is a substantive bill to support Israel, but then the questions become about the politics, the ability to get it through the Senate and the White House. I do think it's worth noting that the White House has already threatened to veto it, which does not strike me as a productive idea, given this is kind of the opening salvo in a negotiation. It would seem to me to be more productive to try to work with the House behind the scenes and the Senate, given that there is still some chance here that these bills are combined. Now, the Senate wants to move a combined package that covers Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and border security. And I think that's right on the strategic merits. I don't think that is what Washington calls a Christmas tree bill where you just hang on a bunch of unrelated stuff. I think there really is a common strategic thread. But you also have the reality in the House that Johnson's a new speaker and there has been opposition to Ukraine. So I think the question right now, the House wants to kind of strengthen its hand by passing this standalone bill and then negotiate later. And I think, like I said, the larger picture is about getting it done and the urgency of it and whether the U.S. can demonstrate to the world that it will support its friends. And we should be agnostic about the particular merits of these strategies of different ways of combining them.
According to a Politico report on the House bill, here's a few more details of it. It includes $4 billion for transferring missile defense systems to Israel. Those are Iron Dome and David Sling. Another $4.4 billion to replace inventories of U.S. weapons and equipment that are sent to Israel, and also reimburse training and other services, $3.5 billion for the State Department in foreign military financing to help arm Israel, and then $4.4 billion to use broadly on, quote, attacks in Israel through next September. Kim, the White House veto threat cites two things. One of them is the failure to include that humanitarian aid, including for Gaza, that the president had asked for. And two is the way that the House bill proposes to pay for this, which is a section of the bill titled Rescission of Certain Balances Made Available to the Internal Revenue Service. A total here of $14.3 billion rescinded from the Inflation Reduction Act. And one thing that I would try to make clear here is it cites several sections of the Inflation Reduction Act, IRS provisions, that it is taking money from. But one of those sections is not the section in the Inflation Reduction Act called taxpayer services. So that bill includes about $3.2 billion for taxpayer services, and Republicans are not proposing to touch that. That money would still go to help the IRS answer the phone calls that it has been failing to answer in recent years. What they're talking about is cutting back on provisions on enforcement, on helping the IRS set up a free e-file system to compete with some of the tax filing software that people are probably familiar with. Kim, what do you make of this IRS rescission provision? One of the arguments that you're hearing circulate on the Democratic side is that a lot of this money is going to increase audits that the IRS is doing. And so rescinding that money and lowering the audits is only going to raise the deficit.
Yeah, well, let's just look at this IRS piece in the broader context of what the House is attempting to do, because I think it gets to what Kate was saying and a word she used, which was political reality. I agree entirely that the broad ideas behind all of this money, Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, all fit together, and there is an intellectual consistency to voting them through in one bill. The realities in the House are much different. And what we have here is a brand new speaker who only has 4 votes to spare. Israel is a very popular cause, wildly bipartisan. He has the best shot of getting that piece of money through, especially because it's a manageable piece of money, $14 billion. And it does allow the House to therefore say, we have a target for rescission. We would like to use a pay-for to cover the cost of this particular overseas venture, because let's remember that there is an enormous backlash growing in the House at the moment about a never-ending stream of supplementals and emergency spending and omnibuses like we saw last Christmas, all of which is taking place outside of the regular appropriations process and regular order, with never-ending blowouts on both guns and butter. The obvious place is this IRS money. It was passed on Democratic votes alone as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, which used the reconciliation process to go around Republicans and pass the president's wish list. This $80 billion for the IRS was almost exclusively, as you know, Kyle, targeted toward enforcement of an agency, by the way, I would note, for the past 4 or 5 years has had nothing but poor headlines over its abuses of power. This claim that somehow this enforcement is going to gin up more money for the Treasury is utterly unproven. In fact, the IRS's track record, and you can look at this through the Inspector General reports, through GAO reports, is that for all of its claims that it's going to do this, it doesn't, and has been very poor at the process of going after anybody other than middle-class Americans. So this was essentially a weaponization of the IRS. We've had yet more bad headlines about its behavior since then. It's an obvious target for Republicans to go after. We can talk about the strategic merits of the different plans in the House and the Senate, but the White House complaining about this, they had to have known this was coming. And again, I think it ought to be viewed as a test of whether the administration is willing to give up some, in my mind, useless domestic spending in order to cover very serious national priorities overseas.
One of the arguments from the Senate and from President Biden in doing this as a one package might be worries that Ukraine aid by itself would not be able to pass the House on Republican votes alone, and it could probably pass on a bipartisan basis, but would it be brought to the floor by the new speaker if that is the understanding of how it would go? And it's worth noting that Speaker Johnson in the past has been skeptical of this aid. Last year, he voted no on a $40 billion aid package for Ukraine. And here's what he said: we should not be sending another $40 billion abroad when our own border is in chaos. American mothers are struggling to find baby formula. Gas prices are at record highs, and American families are struggling to make ends meet without sufficient oversight over where the money will go. But notably, that is different than the argument that he made last week Here's Speaker Johnson on Fox News.
We can't allow Vladimir Putin to prevail in Ukraine because I don't believe it would stop there, and it would probably encourage and empower China to perhaps make a move on Taiwan. We have these concerns. We're not going to abandon them, but we have a responsibility, a stewardship responsibility over the precious treasure of the American people, and we have to make sure that the White House is providing the people with some accountability for the dollars, and we want to know what the objective there is. What is the end game in Ukraine? The White House has not provided that.
Kate, it's almost hard to believe that that's the same Mike Johnson, and I guess I welcome his conversion now. If he now sees that failure to deter Putin would only cause Putin to become more aggressive in Europe and would also embolden China maybe to make a move on Taiwan. But what is your view of that? Does that raise the prospects that maybe Speaker Johnson would be able to get a Ukraine-only bill through the House, or maybe even if it could not pass with Republican votes alone, he would bring it up even if it took Democratic votes to get it over the majority?
I think his remarks on Ukraine speak to the reality that there are votes you can take when it's just you and you're a backbencher, and it's a different responsibility when you're Speaker of the House and you're managing an entire conference, and it really does hinge on what you do, whether the bills get through. So I to your point, I welcome these remarks on Ukraine that we don't want Putin to win in Ukraine, and I think it took real political courage to do that amid so much skepticism in his conference. One thing I think Speaker Johnson could do that would be really valuable is develop a Republican position in Ukraine and the House that currently doesn't exist. Currently, there's very deep and pathological opposition to whatever whatever President Biden asks for, but they don't have a plan of their own, even as Speaker Johnson rightly points out that we don't want Putin to win in Ukraine. So I think some of the common points that we hear from critics of Ukraine aid are that President Biden has no plan to end the war, that we are paying salaries of bureaucrats in Kiev, and that no one knows where any of this weapons or this money is ending up. So those are some of the common threads. Well, if those are sincere objections, Republicans can put forward a bill that puts a special inspector general on aid for Ukraine. There's already a lot of oversight across government on Ukraine aid, but if they want to concentrate it in one office and that's the price of their support, then propose it. If they want to trim some of the $11 billion in economic and financial aid that President Biden has asked for, then they can trim it. And the EU, the European Union, has put up a great deal of money on that front in any event. So trim that. They can focus their package on lethal aid to Ukraine and also expanding U.S. military power to be able to supply friends like Ukraine and Israel without so much concern about a shortage on U.S. military power. So they could root a package in that. You know, the complaint about no strategy, no timeline. Well, they could develop a plan that says Biden has to transfer this many Army tactical missile systems to Ukraine by this date to get Ukraine a real breakthrough on the battlefield. They could really step up and try to reclaim this issue as one of their own. And if they think Biden has made it a stalemate, then say, well, here's our plan for victory. We haven't seen that yet. And I think it would be really constructive to try to have a live negotiation and to have Republicans develop some of that muscle memory back that this is the party that typically voters trust on national security. I don't think the Republicans in the House want to surrender that entirely. So I'm hopeful to see that from Speaker Johnson in the coming weeks. And I think it would strengthen, not weaken, the Republican position on Ukraine and getting some of their priorities done.